In 1831, a Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville visits the United States and visits the North, the South, the West, the different areas, and writes about his experiences in a book called Democracy in America. And in this book, we not only get a glimpse of what our democracy, what our government was like, but we get a glimpse of what our society was like. And it's especially striking as you look at the book how different he views the North and the South and the frontier areas of this country. And so, as our country was developing, just like early on in the colonial period, each region kind of had its own character. Now, first, we're going to take a look at the North. And the most important thing going on with the North is industrialization. England had led the way with industrializing, and the United States, an outgrowth of England, was right on England's tail. And so we began to industrialize as well. And that put us in a very good position because we were able to be one of the leading countries in production right behind England. And so that really gives us economically a big jump start over the other nations of the world. Some of the significant things going on during this time period, just to throw them all up there. Samuel Slater is an Englishman who brings what he knows about factories to America and establishes the first little textile mill here. It was his original mill used water power. He built it along a stream, and the water turned the wheel, which turned the machinery, and we gained this knowledge from Britain. We're able to start trying to catch up with them and industrializing. As time goes on, we'll move from water power eventually to coal power, and by the late 19th century, we will see steam power as the main source of energy in these factories. And of course, this will help lead to pollution. And the growth of these factories is going to make significant changes across the North. Economically, we're producing goods in factories. And that means workers are going to leave their homesteads, and they're going to have to go down to the factory to do the work there rather than doing piecework out of their own homes. And it's going to make some significant changes in society. Now, we're also going to see a lot of other things coming along with industrialization. As our industry grows and as our countries grows, we start to see new forms of transportation which help to move raw materials to the factories and the goods out to the consumers, as well as move people back and forth across the country. And so we see, first of all, our country builds turnpikes. They build roads. The government builds roads, toll roads, to help people traveling. We're going to see the Cumberland Road is our first national highway where the United States government builds a highway through the Cumberland Gap to head out west. We're going to see eventually up north canals being built to connect waterways. We're going to see the railroad as the steam-powered train becomes an effective tool of transportation. We're going to see it spread out. And it will especially connect the North and even to a certain degree the South. And we're even going to see steamboats come along and help make transportation possible up and down the rivers. Before, you could only go with the current practically with, moving stuff. It's very hard to fight the current. But now steamboats will be able to go up and down the rivers. So we're starting to see a lot of changes in transportation, which is going to help industry. Now, as we industrialize, there's also going to be some important landmark court cases which are going to help establish business. Remember, Hamilton wanted to make this a country of big business, and he had done everything he could to get us on that path. And some of these Supreme Court rulings are going to help lay the groundwork for business flourishing in America. First of all, Dartmouth College versus Woodward was a case between the board of Dartmouth College and the state. The state was trying to tell Dartmouth College they had to accept certain people on the board. The board said, hey, we get to pick our own board members because that's what's in our charter for the college. And the Supreme Court rules in favor of that charter. And beyond just the college, this establishes the idea that our government respects contracts. And if you're going to have business, you've got to have contracts that are going to be respected by the government. So that helps establish a precedent for big business. Another important ruling in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, the issue was the Bank of the United States. The state of Maryland tried to tax and control the government bank, the national bank of the United States there in Maryland. And in this ruling, the court rules that states do not have supremacy over the federal government. It's the other way around. Therefore, Maryland can't regulate and tax the Bank of the United States. And that establishes that hierarchy. You also have the ruling of Gibbon versus Ogden. And in this one, the steamboats that were starting to operate along the rivers in New York, well, one company had received a monopoly to control steamboat traffic. And in this case, Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court ruled that you can't create monopolies. There has to be competition. And this, of course, will be very important for businesses as well. Now, socially, the workforce is shifting, changing. People are, like we mentioned a minute ago, they're moving from home to actually going down to the factory to do the work there because they can no longer stay at home. The machinery is at the factory. And so men go off to work. Women go off to work. A lot of young women were recruited by some of these early factories to come live in dormitories and work in the factories. And if you're a man and a woman and you're married, and eventually, as we're going to see, these factory jobs don't end up paying a lot, and especially as we continue to see the factories grow and the pay to seemingly not do the job of taking care of a family, we're going to see both the men and women needing to work in the factories. And if you don't have anyone to stay home with the kids, one of the best things is just drag your kid to work and make them work too. And so we see child labor becoming a common thing in the factories. And of course, as we need more and more workers in these factories, the cities get bigger and bigger. Fortunately, we're able to feed that workforce by the fact that we're getting a lot of immigrants coming in from Europe. Especially the Irish are a big group that come over at this time. But Europeans coming to America, many of them, if they're unskilled, they go to the north, they get jobs in factories, and so we see our cities grow. And our culture begins to change as more and more people bring their cultures to America. The conditions living in these cities as they grow become progressively worse. Initially, there's attempts to try to create company towns where the factory builds housing, and it's kind of a model idea to have the housing and a store from the company where people can purchase what they need and they live on the company property. But more and more the factories begin to be simply urbanized. There's the dormitories, like we mentioned, with that women would sometimes live in or workers would live in. But ultimately, most factories are going to just be in the towns. And as the towns grow, we're going to have the slums, as they'll be called, where poor factory workers, often immigrant workers, live in crowded housing, tenement buildings, and they will provide the workforce. They will be paid often very low wages with very dangerous working conditions. And ultimately, we will, at the end of the 19th century, see a progressive movement which will address many other problems, but also the problems in the factories. But up north, the workforce is answered by the population and by immigrants coming in. And as far as social classes go, there's the wealthy elite, the business owners, the rich. At the very bottom, there's the working class, the factory workers, but there's a growing middle class in the middle. This is management positions. This is doctors, lawyers, accountants, people that have jobs that pay a little better than the folks working just unskilled labor in the factories. They have a little bit more money, a little bit better position. They often, as the cities grow, start to move away from the inner cities, kind of out to the edge of town, to the suburban areas. And so we're seeing the modern cities develop and our modern classes develop, and more people begin to join this middle class. Now, down south, things are going to be very different. In the South, this is going to be a society built on agriculture. And so at the very top, you have the aristocracy, the plantation owners. Wealthy plantation owners are going to have the money and the power. They're going to own the largest pieces of land. And they kind of consider themselves to have what they call the paternalistic, this fatherly obligation to the rest of society. They have a fatherly obligation to their slaves, which are going to provide the workforce on their big plantations. They're going to take care of them. They're going to see to them, make sure they work. But even beyond that, they have a paternalistic obligation to the other people, the poor white farmers, the yeoman farmers that live around them. They have an obligation to lead them and to kind of guide society. And so they feel like they are the elite. They are in charge. They're going to run the show. And everybody else is going to kind of follow behind them. Now, beneath them, you have the yeoman farmers, poor farmers that live on small farms. They're not rich. They don't have huge plantations. They don't make lots of money, but they maybe make enough to have a decent living, or maybe they just barely get by. But they at least are free. And because a large portion of the states are in the South are going to be made up of a slave population that has to be kept in their place, to be kept in line so that they don't rebel, the plantation owners are going to need to have the support of the common people. And so they kind of build up this idea that, hey, you're free men, you're white men, you are with us, even though, they're definitely not on that level. They're not treated equally. They're not, they don't have the power that the plantation owners have. There's still this fostered camaraderie of, hey, you're with us and the slaves are below you. And this creates more division in society to keep the slave class in their place. Now, the slaves are going to make up a significant portion of many of these southern states. In fact, in the case of, by the time of the Civil War, South Carolina, 51% of the state was held in bondage. More people were slaves than there were free in that state. And many of the other states that was close to that. So the slave population is going to be a huge part of the people building the southern United States. Now, within slave society, there's three different classes, really, three different groups of slaves. First of all, there are the field hands, and that makes up the majority. Most of them are going to work from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week. They're going to work in the fields, picking cotton or picking tobacco or some other crop. Discipline is going to be rough to keep them in their place, because there's always the fear of rebellion. There's always the fear that they are not going to do the work. And so slave owners are going to make sure that they keep their slaves in line. Slave owners will have overseers, which watch their slaves as they work in the field to make sure they're putting in the amount of work that's expected and to prevent them from running away. And they will use physical violence as punishment if slaves step out of line. They have no freedom. They're not going to be educated, because if they get education, they might get ideas and they might want their freedom. So they're not allowed to be educated, and very few slaves will get that. They're going to be forced to work hard hours. They'll get Sundays off in most cases, but it's a hard life. Nevertheless, they create their own culture. They bring culture with them when they originally come from Africa and from the Caribbean. They mix that culture with the culture they pick up here, with Christianity, which they pick up here. They mix with some of the other ideas that they've picked up elsewhere. And the slaves create their unique culture. They have music, songs, customs, stories, practices, which eventually will become part of America. Just like immigrants bringing their cultures The slaves, with their culture, are influencing America, even though they're not being treated as equals, they're being held as slaves, they're still helping to create the country that we have. Now, a little bit better position than being a field hand is if you are a house servant. If you're in the house, they're going to allow you to dress better because they want you to dress better since you're with the family and around guests. You're going to be preparing food, taking care of children, taking care of household needs. There may even be a very high level of trust. Another situation where slaves might find themselves in, which was even better than being a house servant, was if you were an urban slave. Many times, if you were a slave in an urban area, you were going to have the opportunity to learn a skill. You're a carpenter, you're a blacksmith, you're a baker, and this skill is going to open up other opportunities to you. Sometimes some of the urban slaves were even allowed to use that skill in their free time to go sell their services and make a little bit of money. So an urban slave is going to have more freedom to move, a higher skill, making them a little bit more valuable. And so of these three different general areas where slaves might find themselves, that was often the best situation to be in. The last area of the country is the frontier. On the western frontier, whether you're up in the Ohio region or if you're over in Tennessee, you're out away from civilization. You're out on the edge of the settled lands. And so you're going to need to be able to take care of yourself, and you have to be very resilient. You're going to face a lot of dangers. And so people who live on the frontier, very much like it was in the early days of the colonies, they're mostly farmers, growing what they need to survive. They're going to have to build their own homes. They're going to have to make the things that they need. They're going to have to rely on each other for support and often for protection. They're often far enough out that they don't have the U.S. military or a lot of other people to defend them, and so they have to form their own colonial militias, or some of them are so far out there they can't even do that. Many of them are very daring, and they go out there and they take some extreme risks on the frontier to try to gain some land and build a new life for their families. So I often think about if I had lived back then, would I have gone west, been a frontiersman? And I think kind of if I had been a young man, I would have wanted to go to the frontier. But I can't imagine, once I have a wife, once I have a kid, taking them to the frontier and taking the risk that these frontier families took when they headed out west. But thousands of frontier families push west, settle these areas, and eventually towns grow and it becomes civilized. And we see the United States expand thanks to the risks that they take. Of course, they're going to run into, again, conflicts with Indians, so there'll be more wars and, again, more pushing the native tribes off of their lands and broken treaties with the U.S. as we continue to push further and further west. They're also going to have to petition the government for their big interests, better roads, better protection from the military. They're going to, as the railroads start coming through, they're going to be dealing with the railroads to try to move their crops. And so they'll always have their own issues on the frontier, their way of viewing what they need from society as they try to turn the frontier into the next civilized area of the United States. So throughout this period as America grows, our country is growing in different directions. To the north, an industrialized, modern society. In the south, an agrarian society. Out west, it's still a fairly primitive frontier. And these divisions between the types of regions of the country we have, especially that issue of slavery, but also the economic differences and cultural differences are going to continue to make Americans more and more divided until eventually we get to the point of having a civil war, as we'll see in an upcoming unit.